So thank you. It's such a privilege to be here. It's so nice amongst friends and collaborators. My contribution to this discussion about continuity and innovation is an encouragement, perhaps, of a way of looking at things that exist and the ideas that could come from that observation for making spaces that are new but also relevant to this changing world. I've always been fascinated by the making of the plan and the making of rooms. The room, a contained space describing a certain territory, adjoining to similar spaces and giving outlook to somewhere outside of itself. But it is of course much more than that. I see it as part of a spatial network, promising use but not limiting it, yet providing character and definable limits. And look at this plan of Peter Merkley. It shows a collection of rooms of various sizes. The bath is tucked away in the passage. The rooms have different shapes. The doors positioned wisely to give balance, but also to open up possibilities of connections. The drawing tells you something about the way the architect is thinking. I think of Adolf Loos's statement in his essay, The Principles of Cladding from 1898, in which he emphasizes that the chief and first concern of the architect is with the room and its surfaces, and only after that, the structure. And I think of Louis Kahn's iconic sketch in which is written, "Architecture comes from the making of a room." I'm also drawn to this aspect of a society of rooms or a suite of rooms, which enables a more general or contingent planning rather than a directly functional or specific approach. This is so that the layout of a home facilitates occupation in a variety of ways to suit the needs of the increasingly diverse and multicultural society which is now our common experience. And yet, the current conventions of house planning seem to be promoting the monofunctional space with a hierarchy of one room over another, despite growing evidence of a fundamental shift in the composition and size of domestic households and in the way we actually use domestic space. This resulting mismatch between the development of housing types and the society they are intended to accommodate is an issue that I seek to explore in my teaching practice and, where possible, in our studio in London. It seems necessary more than ever to make rooms, make buildings, make spaces which are likely to outlive their intended use, or at least their intended occupiers. And this means giving rooms and spaces functional promise, an invitation to use, an invitation to curate. Our work, and in a way a sort of interest in everyday things, emerged in the 1990s, the post-Thatcher London, a neoliberal-led policy world. There was real-time austerity. London was very much empty and quite broken. Deindustrialization with large areas of decaying land, but with new wealth coming from the services sector, and with that, gentrification. We enjoyed the broken fabric and additive character of London, the way in which it accepts the new amongst the old without too much fuss. This kind of tolerance was very liberating and something of an inspiration to us. And one of our early projects, we call the Studio House, set out to be ambiguous in its identity. Was it a workshop? Was it a dwelling? And of its use. Was it a place to live or a place to work? An expression of an enlightened and original thinking client. 3 people. They were experimental in the way they lived. They ran a theatre company They formerly lived in an unconverted industrial building. They described an interior that they were hoping for that anticipates a public, but is not a public place. And they liked rooms. We came together with a similar love of Kettle's Yard. We liked the idea that there were no names of rooms. Our drawings show room 1, room 2. The project that we made has no corridors. You're guided through the house without quite knowing where you are until you arrive at a certain perspective or an opening that allows you to fix your position. There is a labyrinthine spatial character that was allowed for by using timber frame construction. The stairs are stacked luxuriously, 2 stairs in a building that is only 4.2 meters wide by 20. You go up one stair and down another. The building is made of very ordinary materials applied directly in their found form with a minimum of shaping, with their thickness suppressed. The facade is a wrapping with plywood with brick slips, built by a carpenter, every piece you see there. Rainwater pipes become figures. Mirror surfaces make ambiguous spatial reflections. In those days, we could hand make windows. We drew it 1-to-1. The drawing you see here is a detail of mine at 1-to-1 on the left and Jonathan Sergison's 1-to-20 elevation, drawn by hand and scribbled over by each of us at the time. The interiors are open for appropriation. There are living spaces all over the house. It's a sort of topography. This attitude is not just about the intimacy of the domestic world or the interior, but also of the city, London, a city which embodies its past. It embodies ideas of the picturesque, but also of the mercantile. Its condition reflects complex patterns of ownership and private actions where neither crown nor state has ever held too much sway. In diversity, there seems to be this beautiful tolerance. It is a city of many centres, but the richness comes in part from these connecting parts, the spaces between, the transitional areas, connective between the very public and the very private. This is Pickering Place in Mayfair, adjacent to one of the most busiest parts of London, the smallest and quietest open space that I know. I think of these characterful places as rooms also. For Jonathan and I, writing emerged as an instinct to observe, to document, to write down, to articulate the world around us, the rooms, spaces between, all to help form a kind of repertoire to work. This is an essay from Papers 1, A Way to Work, deliberately ambiguous. It was my way to work, but it was also beginning to think about a way to work. And in Papers, a later paper publication, the idea of comfort, beginning to question conventional understandings of things, and in so doing understand the origins of things and therefore feed that into the way of making work. Sort of existential, thinking about the home. And having taught together since 1996, actually here at the Architectural Association, Jonathan and I started to teach separately, and in 2009 I began a collaboration with the Swiss architect Bruno Krucker at TU Munich. Teaching was a dialogue in our mind, where the studio was at the centre. We had shared ideas and interests of the as found, of the conditions of the European city, and a shared interest in the Smithsons. 12 years later, we made this book, From the Room to the City, Munich, Urbanity and Complexity. It was an analytical and narrative approach to ways of seeing the European city through the eyes of our host city, our home city, Munich. It was underpinned by a series of exercises over 12 years run with the students at Studio Crooker-Bates. 7 broad themes, related words, an open-ended landscape of ideas. Letters were written and exchanged between Bruno and I, you can see on the right-hand side, introducing each of these loose sections. They traded ideas, observations, memories. They were kind of tender writings to each other. They reinforced not only a dialogue, but a friendship. And within the book are spatial records of spaces in between, made through precise models, which are photographed to represent the atmosphere. And when you encounter the city on the ground, you sense its intimacy and the palimpsest of layer upon layer of past and present, altered, reused, imprinted with earlier traces. And I'm so interested in the generosity of these spaces between things, the territorial depth that's possible. These are special to the citizens of the city. They ennoble their experience, and they need to be protected where they exist and remade, as we've seen already this morning, where they don't exist. Wherever we can, we make those spaces. Here at the social housing in Vienna, the entrance to each of the 3 buildings of which we made one is a public room, a room that's shared by both residents, users of the ground floor, the nursery, and those passing through this ensemble of buildings. And the arcade in the Harbour Building in Antwerp, in which we focused a lot of attention in terms of detail and in budget on making a space that's everyone's and no one's. It's a space that connects harbour front to garden. People pass through it. The gate is open and closed different times of the day. It becomes a very special civic space. I see a relationship between how the city presents itself with linking spaces and special moments, places of rest, places of passage, some comfortably interior, others ambiguously neither inside or outside, with the making of interiors. John Soane's plan for the Bank of England seems to sum so many of those ideas up very well. A project made of inherited parts, evolved progressively from 1877 to 1815 and beyond. And this idea of seeing the interior as a small city is not new, of course. I enjoy Cascia di Mignoni's quote on planning. I am an architect to the last detail, and I find urbanism everywhere. In reality, the apartment is a little city with its paths, its constraints, its social and private spaces. I've always had a passion for small spaces and have always wanted to make them look larger. For example, by lengthening the routes, contrary to some tendency to reduce them. I don't like an entry into the living room because then there is no surprise. And it might be strange to bring John Soane and Cascia di Mignoni together, but I find intriguing parallels and certainly inspiration when thinking about making plans. The mystery in not revealing everything in the first moment, the promise of something, the need to move through in time and space. This is the interior hall of the Piazza Carbonari by Dominioni, a hall space of many sides that changes radically as the doors are opened and closed between the rooms and studies. And the view from the rotunda looking to the passage of the Bank of England with blind doors and intrigue. Oh, I always thought it's so provocative of Soane to build such a theatrical space for the Bank of England. This became a key subject of investigation on the mansion block project that we made in Hampstead. It was commissioned by Pegasus Life, a specialist developer interested in providing alternative living options for elder residents over 60 years old. We were interested in this idea of making private worlds for the elderly residents, appropriately rich, with a constellation of interconnecting rooms of different shapes, no dominant hierarchy, the use of the diagonal. 2 buildings are linked at ground floor with a plinth, a public plinth of shared use. And the cellular and labyrinthine plan is intended to build in multiple private thresholds to empower the owner, to stimulate the experience of a large house, the likely previous home of many of the new residents. The plan is organised around an inner central room. And looking at 2 plan types, I won't walk through them, but you can see there are routes through and between. Bedrooms are treated like separate suites to offer alternative ways of use and occupation. There's always the promise of something more just around the corner. Spaces unfold with a degree of anticipation. Spaces perceptible as fragments remains hard perhaps to comprehend the whole. And it raised a big question for us. Did it really matter that we lost a lot of the control of the interior detailing? Does it matter in this new world? The central room both connects and separates. It gives control to the homeowner rather than the guest. It's a specific idea in response to a specific brief, the targeted resident over 60 years old, whose life and world is getting smaller and whose privacy is constantly compromised by carers, people who care, but effectively you lose your sense of sovereignty. We connected ideas, spatial ideas, to our love of, for example, the paintings of Hammershoy, who consistently explored through his early paintings of 1900 the inner world of rooms, making connections with a social and personal consciousness. This type of plan is made possible by the open spatial structure of thin walls, a tolerant and resilient structure whose geometry is not found via a grid imposed upon the site, but one which responds to the urban footprint and works as a series of circular spans. The project is a very particular response to a very particular situation in which embellishment in some form of the wall felt like the only answer to us to make a building that was robust enough to handle this extraordinary environment of third generation arts and crafts villa architecture. We've always seen the relevance of past ideas on domesticity, feeling that they can inform a way of progressing domestic space to the future. And we use reference to develop a discussion between ourselves, between collaborators in the studio. On the left is a small book called Both Directions at Once, in which we invited one of our senior team members to bring together from our reference library a series of paired references that could be offered ambiguously in a way in their reading, offered to the studio as a little sort of gift, but in the end a working tool. In that book, there's the plan of a townhouse in Bayonne in southwest France. It's built in 1748, it's 200 square meters, it's an apartment, 1 floor. There's a central room surrounded by characterful adjoining rooms. The plan works with spatial depth. There are alternative ways through. There's the use of pochette. We see the relevance of this plan. And at Munich, TU Munich, We've been encouraging this investigation towards general or contingent planning rather than this sort of functional, brief answer work. The intention is to look beyond the convention, beyond the real estate or the perfect Swiss plan, to understand and develop plans as spatial assemblies with hierarchy, with character. And the plan as a spatial network gives possibilities towards collective thinking, collective living, where this collection of rooms is more interesting than the party walls dividing ownership. If you look at the early sketches of the courtyard housing in Lavender Hill on the left, what you see is a kind of ambition for a single mat-like structure of rooms, some outside, others inside, filling the site with a garden at the centre. The position of the ownership is not really that interesting. Of course, it has to become so by the time the plan is realised for construction. But it's not the origination of the plan, which you see on the right, which I hope you see the connections. At the centre is the inner courtyard, perhaps an important reminder that this is always about a combination of let's say, a destination shared space that can only work if there are comfortable amenity spaces within the plan of each of the dwellings as well. It is a collective project, but within the frame of a private rented housing scheme. The client, a kind of well-meaning local developer who never sells their buildings, but rents for the long terms and has done for 152 years. This is building for the future typologies that can evolve and develop well beyond their first and second and third use. You see in this picture the courtyard at the ground floor level, a private space, which then links on the first floor to this expanded upper terrace. So these shared outside spaces that are very private to each of the dwellings are then complemented by the garden itself. And as the scale of projects has increased over time in the studio, so too has the thinking evolved about what a room or a territory can be. In papers 3, I wrote an essay called 10 More Rooms, having written 10 rooms a few years before, which was really about domestic space. This was a set of observations about the changes that happen in one's mind and thinking and in making of moving from the domestic world to sort of the public world, completely inspired by the writings of Mark Pimlott and, amongst other things, the book, The Public Interior as Idea of Project that he made in 2016. It is a masterful thesis about the public interior. Ideas of where we consider ourselves as a free individual and where we see ourselves amongst others, and the way the public interior and the interiors affect and condition our consciousness and our behaviour. It's become an increasingly relevant area of thinking and sort of ambition, let's say, in the work of the studio. But I'm reminded that despite our early practice being focused on housing, our first ever built building was a public building, a public house, which we took literally when we began thinking about what it could be. Not just a pub, but a community space, a public room, a hall house under a big roof. In a big room, space needs to unfold episodically. Space is just off, semi-enclosed, to look out from. A big picture window, low cafe area. Incidents within a large and structured space delineated by columns. There are various territories that become evident when people begin to occupy the spaces. And at the time, we were really interested in the way that we could document that type of public space. working with a reportage photographer in which the focus was on the activities and the architecture fell into the background. And later projects like the undergraduate business school in Commercial Road in London, we understand the public interior, in this case as installing objects to create spaces between, learning spaces that thread through the project, reusing the rooms that we inherit, giving them new promise. This is a 4.5 meter long scroll of all the rooms of the existing building, and our suggestion to the client that the school already existed. We just needed to rename the spaces. These ideas are always informed by reference, by looking back and learning from things that we observe and see, whether it be down the street on the walk to work, or indeed through cultural reference. These beautiful carpentry objects placed into a large shell-like church, and the common all-purpose room on the right-hand side of Jacobus Well, with the bed as a piece of furniture, the fireplace extraordinarily large in this tiny space. These are great inspirations for us when thinking about the public interior. And at Canal, we're embracing the incremental and the contingent, seeing public space as cultural space. The building is the size of a city block. It's organized by its public space, the Cardo Decumanus, the cross routes you can see in the plan. There are many ways into the building. Over 2/3 of the spaces are public. The institutions are embedded within the notion of public space. The focus of the project is actually on production, so less about the confrontation between the public and private art, more about a bringing together through production and making a public space in which you encounter art. There are a variety of spaces that feel comfortable and very varied in character. You wander. You can even find yourself alone in this project. And at Leuven, where we're making the Performing Arts Quarter, the new theatre, which is here, is fully integrated into the medieval city. This is the courtyard that connects with also these two bridges at first floor level that connect to the Romansport former monastery. And while it's completely integrated, it's also asking new questions, in this case, about what performance and what a performance space means in the current, in the new world, let's say, in this world. We're inspired by thinking about old hierarchies turned on their head, or added new potential hierarchies alongside the old ones. The Teatro Officina by Lina Bobadi makes a kind of extraordinarily long performance space in which audience and performers are within touching distance. There's a strong sense of the incidental and the transitional in the architecture and indeed in the performances. And so too, from our point of view, we're exploring those ideas within the theatre, which has, on the one hand, a frontal entry through a series of traditional and conventional territories into the main theatre. And on the other hand, through, for example, what we call the living room, which is a room that opens directly to the main street, Brusselstraat, that runs straight to the centre of the city. And on the other hand, along its length, off this courtyard between the monastery and the theatre, the Jardin d'Hiver, which is a linear glazed green space provides opportunities to enter the theatre at any point, not just through the progressive traditional territories. And the main theatre space that can be used for other things, book markets in the weekend, for example, but as well as holding productions that are coming from elsewhere, not just designed for the building itself. In summary, we're always exploring around the edges of convention. It's something that defines our interest and our approach. And as the expansion of projects occur from small-scale domestic spaces to very public interiors, there are still so many lessons that are constantly learnt from what exists already in our cities, from good rooms to outside spaces, between things, to communal rooms and public interiors. The art of inhabitation is always at the heart of our investigation, as Peter Smithson said. Making places that inhabitants should be able to appropriate. The spaces within the house or within a public building should accommodate to individual changes, to individuals' patterns of use. Thank you.